Good evening, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. My name is Spencer Gross, and I'm the Programs Manager here at Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Tonight, we welcome Dan Schnur for the Dan Schnur Political Report. His topic tonight is Income, Education, and Ethnicity, Understanding the 2024 Electorate. For those of you who would like to submit questions for Dan, there is a Q&A button, and that is at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. Katie Gilman, our Membership and Communications Coordinator, will be managing your questions during the Q&A, which should start at about 30 minutes. Dan, we are looking forward to another great program, and I turn it over to you.
Well, Spencer, thank you so much. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet Spencer yet, he hasn't been with the World Affairs Council Town Hall that long, but he's been a terrific addition to our team. And I'm glad to have him with us tonight, and very, very happy to have him with us as part of our programming. He and Katie have both been terrific additions, and we're grateful for all their good work. So the last time we gathered in early July, quite a bit has happened in the presidential campaign. And although the topic tonight, as Spencer mentioned, is to talk about the demographic characteristics of the electorate and what that might mean for the election going forward, there has been so much happening in campaign-related news that it's worth taking, I think, just a couple of minutes at the beginning of the program, maybe a few more minutes at the beginning of the program, to talk through some of those developments. So since we were last together in July, the number of indictments against Donald Trump has doubled, and as of Monday, we're now up to 4. And in the meantime, on the other side of the aisle, the number of special counsel appointed in the Justice Department's investigation of Hunter Biden, the president's son, has increased by 1. And I raise these two sets of legal challenges not to equate them, but rather to reflect on the growing reality that most of the 2024 presidential campaign is going to take place in the courtroom. Now, we're going to spend most of our time today, as I mentioned a moment ago, talking about the voters, particularly the demographic makeup of the electorate. But let's talk about some of this news, because a lot of campaign news this year is coming not from the traditional campaign trail, but from the judicial system. And we're just beginning to get a sense of how that is going to affect the discussion surrounding the campaign over the next 15 months. Now, as I said earlier, Trump received his 4th indictment earlier this week. And while I don't think it's necessarily a good use of our time to go through all 4 in great detail, it is worth taking a few minutes to talk about the political ramifications of these cases. So as a first step, let's find out from all of you how you regard each of these various allegations and indictments against the former president. So if we can put up the first question. So for all of you to consider, which of these cases against Donald Trump do you think is the most important? In the order that the charges have been leveled and the indictments have been filed, do you think that the case in New York State Court relating to Trump's business records and the alleged hush money that he paid to Stormy Daniels through Michael Cohen to keep her from talking during the 2020 campaign, is that the most important? Second, is it the controversy over the confidential documents that were transported from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, where Trump maintains his winter residence, of course. Third is the second set of charges filed by special counsel Jack Smith relating to January 6th activities, or Trump's activities in the time leading into and out of the actual counting of the electoral votes on January 6th, 2021. And then finally, just this week, the charges filed in Georgia relating to election conspiracy in that state and half a dozen others, or none of the above. So first question, which of these cases do you think is the most important and the most impactful going forward? And let's see what our group has to say. Very interesting. Very interesting. Wow, not a single person suggests the hush money case is the most important of the 4. And I have to agree with that. Only 3%, interestingly, only 3% of our group thinks that the confidential documents case is the most important. And I will say that there are many legal analysts who believe that not from a political standpoint, but from a strictly legal standpoint, that the confidential documents case might be the strongest one against Trump. The overwhelming majority of you have not surprisingly picked the two most recent indictments to be filed. 46% said that was the activities relating to January 6th, and slightly more, 49% of you, a few more of you, said it's the election conspiracy in Georgia. 3% say none of the above. So what's unique about the Georgia case, and that got the highest response, albeit only by a small margin. So let's talk about that for just a minute. What's unique about the Georgia case is the prosecutor's use of the so-called RICO Act, which targets conspiracy criminal activity and is most frequently used against organized crime targets. The RICO Act actually mandates, and let's underscore the word mandate, actually mandates jail time for anyone found guilty. So even if Trump were found guilty of some of the charges in the New York case, in the documents case, in the January 6th case, it's entirely possible that even a guilty plea, or guilty verdict would result in some type of suspended sentence or non-incarceration type of penalty. Not so much in Georgia, because unlike the federal charges over the confidential documents and the activities surrounding January 6th, not only could Trump not be pardoned, either by himself or another Republican president, but he would actually face jail time. Now, what makes this even more complicated is not only can the president of the United States not pardon someone convicted of a state crime rather than a federal crime. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that Trump were elected president next year or another Republican was elected, they could pardon Trump for the January 6th and the confidential documents cases. A president would not have the power to do so for the state matters, either in New York or in Georgia. But in Georgia, it's even more complicated, because not only can the president not issue a pardon for a state crime, neither can the governor of Georgia. And unlike most states, the governor of the state of Georgia does not have that power. And in fact, the only way a conviction can be overturned in the state of Georgia is by a 5-member commission that actually usually only considers appeals after a sentence has been completed. And the exceptions to that waiting period, on the very rare occasions that this commission will hear and potentially reverse a conviction before the sentence has been served, the exception to that almost always is almost granted to pardon applicants who've taken responsibility for their actions and shown remorse for them. So think about that. If Trump or one of the other 18 individuals who were indicted this Monday in Georgia is convicted, not only could they not be pardoned by the president or by the governor, but the only way to get pardoned by this 5-member commission is, again, and I quote, to take responsibility for their actions and to show remorse for those actions, unquote. And I have to say that whether you are a Democrat or Republican, a Trump supporter or not, that showing remorse, let's just say that doesn't sound very Trumpish, does it? But the question of which trial will have the greatest impact was actually sort of an unfair question, because I'd argue that the most important trial is whichever comes first. Remember that each of these 4 trials may be taking place as the campaign is unfolding. And it's my own opinion that if Trump is found not guilty in the first trial to be heard, that could work to his political benefit. A conviction, of course, would do him great political harm. Even many Republicans who are now supporting Trump tell pollsters they'd no longer vote for him if he were found guilty. But the first impression is going to be a particularly strong one. And right now, Jack Smith, the prosecutor in both federal cases, has requested the beginning of January as his desired start date for the January 6th trial. And the courts generally try to give priority to federal over state proceedings anyway. So it's more likely than not that the Washington, D.C. January 6th trial will come first. And then the others, at least most likely, will get underway at some point over the course of the spring. But all four of these timelines are up in the air right now. And so what I'd encourage you to do is not next week, but the week after. On Monday, August 28th, there's a hearing in Washington, D.C., in which the judge will grant Jack Smith the January start date that he's requested, or whether Trump's lawyer, or we'll see whether Trump's lawyers are able to delay that start date. So within about 10 days, we'll know when the first of those trials will start. And although there's no precedence for any of this stuff, obviously, so there's no way to predict, it looks more likely than not that the January 6th trial will come first, to be followed by the Georgia case, the Mar-a-Lago documents, and ultimately the New York case. But regardless of when these cases are heard, it seems that most voters already have their minds made up, one way or the other, meaning that only a small number of undecided voters in a general election could end up making an immense difference. In other words, think of it this way. Although, as I said earlier, some Republicans who are currently supporting Trump would not vote for him if he were convicted in one or more of these cases, polls make it very clear that the overwhelming majority of American voters, they know how they're going to vote next year. And a guilty or an innocent plea is not going to affect their vote. So the logical question, which I'll put to you, and can we put up question number 2, is have Donald Trump's, and for that matter, Hunter Biden's legal challenges affected your vote? Obviously, we have more than a year to go before the election, but I know our group well enough to know that most of you probably already have a strong opinion on who you're going to vote for president next year. So the question is, have these legal challenges on both sides, both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden, have they had any impact on your vote? Number one option is, have you, as a result of what you've learned about these cases, moved you from either voting Democrat to voting for a Republican, either Donald Trump or otherwise? Presumably, you learned something about Hunter Biden's case that has moved you from Democrat to Republican. Second, have you learned something about Trump and the case of the charges against him that may have moved you from voting Republican to voting Democratic? Third, has it not changed your mind at all? You were likely to vote Republican before all this happened. You're still likely to vote Republican. And then fourth, are you a Democrat? And you're definitely going to vote for a Democrat next year, regardless of how these cases go. So let's see what the answer to question number 2 is for everybody, if we can. Okay, no one, not a single voter, and no single member of our group, and I can't say I'm surprised by this, has decided as a result of these trials to move, or these legal proceedings to move from Democrat to Republican. A pretty small number, a handful of you, were leaning Republican, but these cases have caused you to shift over to the Democratic side, and that's reflected in the electorate as a whole. 4% of you, also a very small number, are a Republican at the beginning and are still a Republican, and the legal proceedings aren't changing it at all. And 85% of you, as we know, our group does lean pretty heavily leftward. 85% of you were voting Democratic before all these legal challenges started to move forward. You're still voting Democrat. So not much real surprise on that one. And let's go on. But one thing I will mention to you, looking forward, is Trump has called a news conference for this upcoming Monday. Some of you may have read about this. And Trump has said that in his news conference, he plans to announce evidence that he believes will once and for all demonstrate that the 2020 election was fixed and that the charges against him in this DC case and in this Georgia case are completely invalid. Now, for the reasons I just mentioned, and as we saw in our own poll, it doesn't seem likely that Trump's news conference is going to impact many votes one way or the other. And it's just as likely to influence the court proceedings. I can't imagine any of the 4 judges fundamentally changing the way they administer their respective cases based on what Trump presents on Monday, although obviously there's no way to know for sure. And just this afternoon, though, it's been reported that Trump's own lawyers are telling him that the news conference could end up hurting him legally. In other words, not only could it not impact his legal proceedings, but it could actually damage his prospects in court. So we'll see if the news conference ends up happening at all. But the question for us to ask ourselves is, if Trump's news conference isn't going to win him political support, and if it's not going to help him in the courtroom, why in the world is he holding a news conference? And the answer for that comes 2 days later. Because remember that next Wednesday night, August 23rd, is the first Republican presidential debate. And this is a debate that Trump has said that he's not attending, at least as of 5 o'clock Pacific time today. But by holding a news conference about the charges against him just 2 days before the debate, Trump has basically ensured that all of the 7 Republicans who will be on stage are going to be forced to address the charges against him in the court cases that he's facing. Now, the debate moderators have already indicated that they will ask the Republicans on stage about the various cases. And while the other candidates will certainly be asked about any number of other economic and foreign and social and cultural policy matters, it's very, very difficult to see anything driving the news coverage out of the debate other than what the other candidates have to say about Trump. So even if Trump himself is not on stage, and of course he could change his mind up until the last minute and decide to participate, Chris Christie and Mike Pence and others are currently trying to goad him into debating by suggesting he lacks the courage to get on stage with them. But even if Trump is not part of the debate, he will almost certainly end up dominating the entire evening and completely overshadowing his competitors. So why is Trump thinking about holding a news conference on Monday? Because he knows that that's just as good as being on the debate stage on Wednesday to force the conversation in a direction that he believes will be beneficial to him, at least in a Republican primary. Now, one person who's not talking about Trump is Joe Biden. And the White House has made it very clear that the current president will not be commenting on his predecessor's legal challenges, which I would suggest is a strategy that's going to be a lot harder to sustain once both the trials and the campaign are underway. But Biden believes that talking about these things at all will make it much easier for Republicans to portray the cases as a partisan plot against Trump. And Biden's advisors believe that the indictments will get so much public and media attention anyway that the president not talking about it won't make much of a difference. But that's going to get harder and harder, like I was saying a minute ago. That's going to get much harder as the election draws closer for Biden to avoid talking about these cases. So let's go to our third question, if we can. What do you think? If you were advising Joe Biden and the White House, would you tell them that the president should be talking about the indictments or that he shouldn't be? Option one, yes, Biden should address the indictments. It's obviously top of the mind news and carries extraordinary, not just political, but governmental and constitutional consequences. So of course the president should be talking about them. Second, Biden should not be talking about this because it does make the cases against Trump look more partisan and gives Trump supporters one more talking point against him. But staying out of it altogether really might represent a missed opportunity for the Democrats. So even if President Biden himself isn't talking about the Trump indictments, maybe his advisors should be talking about it. And then third and finally, now they should all just stay away from it altogether. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, White House staff, Democrats in Congress, don't get in the middle of this at all. So what's your strategic advice for Biden? Do you think he ought to be talking about the Trump indictments or not? Wow, look at that. Only 6% believe that the president ought to be talking about Trump's indictments. 37% have sort of split the difference, a little bit more than a third of you saying that Trump shouldn't talk about it, but his advisors should be making the case. But 57% say they should stay away from it altogether. And if you add up those two bottom numbers, 94% of our group doesn't think it makes sense for Biden or Democrats to be engaging in this discussion at all. But once again, it's going to get a lot more difficult going forward. All right. So we've spent a lot more time on the Trump legal matters than I'd planned. I guess now I know how the media feels on the days when he's in court. It's awfully tough to avoid, isn't it? But I did want to spend some of our time talking about the voting trends among different demographic groups, which I think will help us understand the political landscape heading into the election season even better. Before we dig in even deeper, I'm going to ask you one more question. And I've asked you this question in the past, but in a few minutes, I'll explain why I'm asking it again today. So can we put up the fourth question? Pretty straightforward here. And again, we've asked this of you in the past. Of the various policy issues that matter to you as a voter, both in the presidential campaign and more broadly, which policy area is the most important to your vote? Is it economic policy, taxes, budget, deficit? Is it foreign policy, international relations, the war in Ukraine, challenges in China, North Korea, Middle East, and elsewhere? Or third, is it social and cultural issues, issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, gun control, and gun ownership? I realize that for anyone who's a well-informed voter like all of you, all of these issues are going to play into your thinking. But if you had to prioritize one of these groups over the other, which would it be? And what did we get from our group for this one? Wow, that's not, I wouldn't have expected that. 36%, a little bit more than 1/3, say economic issues. Slightly less than that, 26% say foreign policy. And generally, our group tends to lean a little bit more heavily onto international issues. So that's very interesting to me. And 39%, the most of all, slightly more than economic issues, say social and cultural issues, like the ones I mentioned earlier, abortion and guns, and so on. So what this tells me is that our group reflects changes that have taken place much more broadly in the American electorate over the years. And I want to take just a few minutes and explain my thinking to you. For most of modern political history, for most of the 20th century, the most important voting issue for most Americans was, well, let me do this another way. The most important and the most telling demographic characteristic for most American voters in determining their vote was income. And for most of the 20th century, for most of the modern political era, income told us more than anything else whether someone was likely to vote Democratic or Republican. The more money they made, the more likely they were to vote Republican. The less money they made, the more likely they were to vote Democrat. But then in the 1980s and 90s, in the latter part of the 20th century, we began seeing a shift. First, you may remember in 1992 when Bill Clinton ran for president. He spent a lot of time, and so did a bunch of other, what they called at the time, New Democrats, spent a lot of time trying to appeal to economically successful but socially liberal voters to vote Democratic. You may remember the term from that era. You may remember the term soccer mom. And soccer moms, and to be fair, soccer dads, were suburban voters who tended to be more economically successful and therefore more economically conservative, but tended to be more moderate to liberal on social and cultural matters. And what Clinton and Dianne Feinstein and other of the New Democrats of that era said was, they'd say to these voters, we're not those old style tax and spend Democrats. We're New Democrats and we're more fiscally responsible. And since we're going to be more economically responsible, came the message from the New Democrats, you soccer moms and soccer dads, you economically successful suburban parents, you can feel free to vote on social and cultural issues like abortion, like guns, like environmental policy. And so a huge numbers of economically successful, socially moderate to liberal voters began to shift from the Republican Party, their historic home, to the Democratic Party. But the same trend in reverse was something that Republicans had been advocating, starting to some degree as early as Richard Nixon campaigns for president in the 1960s and 70s, and through the Reagan era of the 80s. But in the 90s in particular, at the same time that Democrats were reaching out more aggressively to these soccer parents, these suburban voters, at the same time, Republicans began reaching out just as aggressively to working class voters who were economically blue collar, but more conservative on cultural and social issues. Think of them if we were talking about soccer moms on one side. The term that got used occasionally to describe these working class voters was NASCAR dads. And so at the same time that economically conservative, socially moderate to liberal voters were switching from Republican to Democrats, at the same time, equally large numbers of economically working class, blue collar, socially conservative voters were switching from Democratic to Republican. And so what ultimately happened is by 2004, when George W. Bush and John Kerry ran against each other for president, income was no longer the single most reliable demographic for partisan voting behavior. If you wanted to know on the basis of a demographic characteristic whether someone voted Republican or Democrat, by the early 21st century, that demographic indicator to look for was no longer income, but rather what the political scientists call religiosity. Religiosity, not the religious faith that you practice, but rather the intensity with which you practice it, had become the most reliable voting indicator as voter concerns began to shift from economic to social and cultural issues. And so by the early 21st century, we saw that those individuals who attended religious services, church or synagogue, once a week or more, were far more likely to vote for Bush than for Kerry. And those who attended religious services once a month or less, church or synagogue or otherwise, were far more likely to vote for Kerry than for Bush. Now, those numbers continued to grow throughout over the next decade. More and more voters would vote on cultural and social issues, and so we'd see larger and larger numbers of this religious dichotomy. Secular voters leaning more and more Democratic, religiously inclined voters leaning more and more Republican. Then, by the middle part of the second decade of the 21st century, what we began to see was an expansion of this cultural and social debate, reflecting not just a voter's religiosity, but their levels of education. And what we saw in both 2016 and 2020 is that the level of educational achievement that a voter attained became the most reliable predictor of partisan voting behavior. And that gap will almost certainly grow even more next year. And so college-educated voters who tended to lean heavily Republican for most of the 20th century were now voting Democrat in very, very large numbers. And those working class voters I was talking about earlier, who hadn't gone to college, well, they tend to vote very, very heavily Republican. Now, our group with World Affairs Council Town Hall, this is obviously a very well-educated group. But it is worth remembering that the large majority of Americans did not attend college, and an even smaller percentage graduated. So it shouldn't be surprising that this summer's Supreme Court decisions on college loan forgiveness and affirmative action were actually both very popular with the voters. And there's growing evidence that a class and education-based resentment that has been one of the keys to Trump's success in his campaigns with working class, non-college educated voters is a direct result of this dynamic too. For those of you who didn't see it, David Brooks wrote an excellent column on this topic in last week's New York Times. And if you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage it. So we're at the bottom of the hour, and we're going to go for about 5 more minutes on this demographic question, because like I said earlier, we did end up taking a little more time on the Trump indictments than I'd intended. So let's go into demographics a little bit more. In about 5 minutes, we'll shift to the second portion of the program, and I'll be excited to try to answer as many of your questions as possible. But what I wanted to talk about now is we talk about this religiosity gap. We talk about this education gap driving the divisions in the electorate. What we're now seeing is that these cultural gaps between working class and college educated voters are so strong that those divisions and those leanings are beginning to supersede even racial and ethnic voting patterns. Now, for many, many years, both Black and Latino voters have overwhelmingly supported Democrats. But Trump increased his level of support among both Black and Latino voters between 2016 and 2020. And while Democrats still win large majorities in these communities, the margins are not nearly as large as they have been in previous elections. And so the shift from Democrat to Republican in these voter groups is coming predominantly from working class males. And for these working class men from the Black and Latino communities, this class-based populism is driving them even more than traditional racial and ethnic demographic alignments. Now, Biden, in order to be reelected, needs to win both the Black and Latino vote by very large numbers. And right now, the main reason that national polls are showing Biden and Trump so close in head-to-head matchups is because of the Black and Latino voters who are shifting from Democrat to Republican based on these trends. And we'll talk more about this as the election goes forward to see whether Trump and perhaps other Republican candidates can continue to increase their support among Black and Latino voters on class-based questions, or whether historic racial and ethnic leanings ultimately take priority. But right now, this is a dead even election. And the reason for that, among other things, is that shift among Blacks and Latino men, for the reasons we were talking about earlier. Now, the other demographic category that I'd want to talk to you about just briefly is age. And once again, I'd like to start with a question and then talk about your responses in the context of this topic for a few minutes before we get to the second portion of the program. So can we put up the fifth and final question? So this is a personal question. Has your partisan voting behavior changed as you've gotten older? Yes, I've gotten much more liberal as I've gotten older. Option 2, yes, I've gotten more liberal, but only slightly. Third, no change. As I've gotten older, my voting behavior has not changed much one way or the other, whether Democrat or Republican. Fourth, yes, as I've gotten older, I've gotten slightly more conservative, but only slightly. And fifth and finally, as I've gotten older, I've become much more conservative. So this is a very personal question, and of course, it's an anonymous one. So how would you categorize your own voting trends over the course of your lifetime? Do we have responses yet? Yep, we sure do. Well, look at this. This is very interesting. Even from our group, which leans fairly heavily leftward, 31%, if you combine those top two categories, say that they've gotten more liberal as they've gotten older. 50% say no change at all. And then 19% say that they've gotten more conservative. Now, historically, among the overall electorate, and again, we do have a somewhat left-leaning group here for our webinars, but among the broader electorate, many voters historically have become more conservative as they get older. And there's no question that today's youngest voters lean overwhelmingly Democratic. So if you look at the overall age makeup of the electorate, even in these very close to even Biden versus Trump polls, Trump does best among older voters. Biden does best among the younger ones. But even though, and this is not reflected in our group, but even though the trend of shifting rightward with age has been something we've seen historically in American politics, that trend isn't nearly as pronounced as many people think. Now, one of the reasons over the years that older people have tended to vote more conservative is that as people get older, they tend to move up the professional ladder and therefore the socioeconomic ladder as well, and to become wealthier. And those economic tendencies have driven older voters to the Republican Party. But as we talked about just a few minutes ago, the shift from economic policy to social and cultural issues means that those professional successes no longer drive voting behavior the way they once did. So when Republicans do win older voters, as they do in many communities around the country, it tends to be less on economic issues than on policy like crime and immigration matters. But more and more often, long-term voting habits tend to drive party allegiance to a much greater degree than a shift over age. So what does that mean? That means that we've seen political science research that shows that if a young person votes for one party's candidates in their first 3 presidential elections, if you as a young person vote for one party or the other in your first 3 elections, when you're 18, when you're 22, when you're in your mid-20s, those young people who vote for one party's candidates in 3 elections in a row, right after they become eligible to vote, those young people are much more likely to remain a supporter of that party for the rest of their lives. So it shouldn't be surprising that the most Republican voting cohort of any age group are those voters who cast their first ballots in the 1980 presidential election between Reagan and Carter, and then went on to vote Republican in 1984 and 1988 as well. And one of the reasons that Republicans are currently so concerned about Gen Z and younger millennial voters leaning Democratic is that they're forming lifelong voting habits now, and that those who voted against Trump in 2016 and 2020 are likely to do so again next year, and that those voters become Democrats for most of their lives, the same way those Reagan-era voters are still voting Republican in large numbers. Now, of course, that means these young people are going to have to vote. And while Gen Z and millennials are unlikely to vote Republican next year, the question is whether Biden can motivate them to vote. The answer is that he probably cannot. But Biden's advisors are hoping that last year's Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade will inspire young people much more than Biden himself can. And that a distaste for Trump among these younger voters will motivate them too, even if they don't think that much of Biden himself. Lots of other things we can talk about here in terms of demographics, and we'll almost certainly need to get back to this broader conversation in a future webinar. But for the time being, I've gone several minutes too long, and I really do want to get to your questions. So if we can start on that second portion, let's do it. Katie, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on here. And thank you as always for joining us. That was a great analysis and discussion to start off our hour today. So we have so many questions coming in, so I think we should just get started. What do you say?
Do it. Sounds good.
I just want to ask this first, since you just touched on it in your discussion, but about younger voters, how exactly will an increase in Gen Z voters impact the 2024 election overall?
Okay. Well, this is the question that we touched on briefly right at the end, so I'm glad to be able to go into it a little bit further. We know that young people are much less enthusiastic about Biden than any other age group. We know that much larger numbers of young people would like to see someone other than Biden run for president, the Democratic nomination next year, than older voters. We know that younger people tend to give Biden much lower rankings on economic, on other issues than their parents and grandparents. That said, because your generation, Katie's, and the one that immediately precedes you, leans so heavily Democratic, the lack of enthusiasm for Biden is not necessarily going to translate into votes for a Republican candidate, whether Trump or someone else. Now, there are some Democrats, some Democratic strategists who think that if Republicans were to nominate a younger candidate, perhaps Ron DeSantis, perhaps Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, that nominating someone so much younger than Biden might bring some young people over. But I think what the Biden campaign strategists have pretty much resigned themselves to now, as I mentioned a moment ago, is Biden is never going to inspire these young people. But if the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade can excite them in a way that Biden himself can't, if Trump can motivate these young people in a way that Biden himself can't, then the fact that Biden himself doesn't engender enthusiasm among Gen Z and millennial voters might not cost him. But make no mistake, this is a question about motivation, not persuasion for the Biden campaign. They don't have to worry about younger voters switching to Republicans. What they do have to worry about is these young people simply not voting at all.
Thank you very much. And moving on to definitely one of the hottest topics in the queue. Is there a ban on a candidate running for president if he is convicted of committing a crime? And if so, could that candidate pardon themselves?
Okay, so interestingly enough, the Constitution only lays out very, very broad eligibility for someone to be a president of the United States. They have to be at least 35 years old, and they have to be born in this country. There is nothing in the Constitution that talks about whether a president is ever been accused of a crime, convicted of a crime, or even imprisoned. So back in the 1920 election, the 1920 presidential campaign, Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party nominee for president, was actually in jail at the time of his campaign. Now, Debs obviously was not elected president, but the point is that there was nothing that prohibited him from running or from being elected, even while he was serving in prison. And so there was nothing similarly that would prohibit Trump from running, getting elected, or serving, even if he is found guilty in one or more of these cases. As far as a pardon goes, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. Presidents can only pardon individuals for federal crimes, not for state level crimes. And it's an open question. It's never been determined constitutionally whether a president can pardon himself. But regardless, if Trump is convicted of one of the two state crimes, either in New York State or in Georgia, then neither he nor another Republican president could pardon him after the election. So yes, he could be pardoned by the two federal cases, but not by the state ones.
I appreciate your clarification on that. And sticking to Trump for a second, what effects could a delay of Trump's trial to 2026 have on the 2024 election?
Well, one of the things that's going to be driving these legal fights for the next few months at least is that the prosecutors in all the cases, whether Smith in the federal cases, whether Willis in Georgia, whether Bragg in New York, they want these cases to proceed as quickly as possible. The Trump attorneys, on the other hand, are going to try to delay as long as possible. And this goes back to something I mentioned earlier. You may have heard, Katie, that I said earlier that while most voters have made up their minds about who they're going to vote for, regardless of the court cases, there's a significant number of Republican voters who currently support Trump, but would not vote for him if he were convicted in one or more of these cases. So if you're a Trump advisor, you don't want any of these cases to be decided before November of 2024, because a conviction in any one of them could cost them a necessary portion of support from Republican voters. So as I mentioned earlier, on August 28th, a week from Monday, the judge in Washington, D.C. will be hearing both the prosecution and the defense arguing for court dates. Jack Smith, the Justice Department prosecutor, wants the trial to begin on January 2nd of next year. Trump's lawyers are trying to delay it. But it seems pretty clear now that while Republican voters, at least, are willing to look past the fact that Trump is being accused of crimes. If he were convicted, that would have a much more dramatic impact on the election. That's why we're seeing such a strong back and forth about how quick or how slow the cases should move forward. The other thing to keep in mind before we go on to the next question is, although they will start at different points, it's almost certain that these 4 cases will be taking place concurrently. And already we're beginning to see how various court dates from the 4 different trials are beginning to bump up against each other. Donald Trump is only one person. And if trials are taking place concurrently in Florida, in Georgia, in Washington, and New York, that's going to take up an awful lot of time, which he and his supporters argue puts him in an unfair disadvantage in the presidential campaign. One more reason that they want to see the trials delayed until post-election.
Okay, and so sticking to the theme for a second here of legal challenges, what impact will Hunter Biden's legal challenges have on Joe Biden's race?
Well, first of all, like I said at the outset of the program, I'm not attempting to equate between the two. Donald Trump is a former president of the United States. Hunter Biden, while related to a president, has not held office himself. And while the charges against Hunter Biden are very serious, I think it would be very difficult for anyone but an unusually ardent Trump supporter to argue that the charges against the former president are not much more serious, particularly those having to do with the 2020 election. That said, it appeared that Hunter Biden was going to come to a plea agreement with government prosecutors and receive a relatively small penalty for the tax and gun charges that have been leveled against him. As most of our group knows, because they follow the news, ultimately that plea agreement fell apart. That's when the Justice Department decided to appoint a special counsel, all but ensuring that because there is no plea agreement and because there is now a special counsel in place in Hunter Biden's case, it's almost certain that that case too, like Trump's 4 trials, are going to be taking place during a presidential election. And even if there is a disparity in the seriousness of the charges against the 2 men, the fact that both the former president and the current president's son are facing legal issues in an election does to some degree blur the argument. And while I recognize that a large majority of our group intends to vote for Biden next year, I think it is worth noting that even if you are a strong Biden supporter, that there are a lot of Americans who feel like Hunter Biden has gotten treated less severely than he would be if he were not the son of the president of the United States. And that leads to and intensifies some of the class-based resentment that I was talking about earlier. So ultimately, I believe that the Trump trials have a much greater impact than Hunter Biden's. But the fact that Biden will be facing legal challenges throughout the election year does make this argument a much murkier one. And it almost certainly means that the legal proceedings overshadow the happenings on the campaign trail for most of the year.
Thank you so much. So, all right, switching gears a little bit. One audience member said it's been reported that the Republicans in the House of Representatives are proposing to stop paying special counsel Jack Smith for the January 6th case. If this goes forward, how might it affect the negotiations over the federal budget?
It's very difficult to see this going forward in any kind of meaningful way. It's worth remembering that in order for a budget to be passed into law, it not only has to pass the Republican House, it also has to pass the Democratic Senate, and would also have to be signed into a law by a Democratic president. It's impossible to see either a Democratic Senate or President Biden signing off on a budget that impacted Smith's office's funding.
And there you have it. So let's see, what strategies can a presidential candidate employ to effectively appeal to voters in swing states and to secure their support in the upcoming election?
Boy, that's a very broad question, and it's probably one, Katie, that we might want to spend a future webinar on so we can talk about it in the depth and breadth that it deserves. But I think one of the things that's worth keeping in mind, the audience member references swing states. One of the most unusual things about American politics today is how few swing states there are. In fact, 40 of the 50 states have voted for one party's presidential candidates in each of the last 4 elections. 40 of the 50 states have voted for either Republicans or Democrats in every election going back to 2004. There are some analysts who believe that there are only 4 swing states in this election. In fact, my home state of Wisconsin, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Georgia, and the state of Arizona. And they would argue that those are only four states that are really too close to call. My own feeling is that you probably would want to add 4 or 5 other states to that list that might lean in one direction or the other, but are not decided. States like a state like Michigan, which leans Democratic, a state like North Carolina that leans Republican. But either way, just the number of swing states in the country is so much smaller that what we'll almost certainly see in the fall of 2024 are the 2 presidential campaigns spending an overwhelming majority of their time in a very small number of states. Each one of them has different histories, different demographic and cultural makeups, different issue preferences. And in a future webinar, we can go through a few of those states in more detail. But to me, the most important part of the question that the audience member asked is just how little room there is left in the middle. And if the entire presidential election next year is fought in 4, 5, 6 states, that really does mean a concentration of political activity in a way that we've never seen in this country before.
We have major issues, of course, in this country in foreign relations, but right now it seems like the media and even this small vote on this webinar on major issues doesn't necessarily reflect this. So what are your thoughts on foreign unpreparedness?
Well, once again, the kind of topic that we should talk about in real depth over an entire webinar. But what I'd say briefly here tonight is the US's role in the world is obviously of profound importance. And of course, we all know that the LA World Affairs Council's heritage is in international and foreign and global policy more than domestic. The outcome of the war in Ukraine, the broader challenge presented by Russia and even more so by China, ongoing trouble spots in North Korea, in Iran, huge challenges in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. There's no shortage of critical topics that the next president is going to have to lead on. And every single one of those that I just mentioned probably deserves a webinar of its own. There's several others as well. But we have become such a divided country, particularly on cultural and social issues. I shouldn't be surprised that even this foreign policy matters of profound importance have now become less central to most voters' thinking than these social and cultural matters, because we spend so much time thinking and talking and arguing about issues like abortion, issues like marriage equality, issues like guns and transgender education and so on, because they've become such a flashpoint to the divisions in our country. I guess it's easier to see why they've supplanted not just foreign policy, but even economic policy is primary concern to voters. Foreign policy, except during a war time, a war in which the United States is directly involved, foreign policy generally tends to matter less to most voters. Economic policy usually tends to take precedent. The fact that these cultural and social issues tells us not just a lot about the nation's politics, but a lot about the society and culture in which we live.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your excellent analysis. I feel like today we touched on some really broad questions, and then we also got into the nitty-gritty of other topics, so I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Katie. I'm really glad you were able to be part of tonight's program. As I mentioned at the outset, having you and Spencer as part of the World Affairs Council Town Hall team has really been terrific. And for those of you who watch these webinars and our other online programming and haven't attended any of our in-person programming recently, I strongly encourage you to come to the in-person programs, not just because they're fascinating topics, but because you'll get to meet Katie and Spencer. So thanks again for all your help today and all that you and the whole team do for us at World Affairs Council Town Hall. Katie, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I know it's a pleasure for Spencer, and it's definitely a pleasure for me as well. And then also after this, we will be going into the members only roundtable. So if you are a member and you'd like some more face-to-face interaction with Dan, then definitely email me and I can send you the link right away. And we're looking forward to that. And then also our fall programming has now launched on our website. So on September 7th, we're doing a film screening in partnership with Women's Voices Now. On September 14th, in addition to Dan's September program, we will host authors Andrew Hone and Tom Schenker for a conversation on their new book, Age of Danger. And on September 27th, Michael Vickers will join us on Zoom to talk about his extensive career in intelligence. So stay tuned for our emails coming in the weeks in the future as we announce additional fall programming, and we can't wait to see you guys soon. So thank you so much. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.